Good evening and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Trey Grayson. I'm a director of the Institute of Politics, and we're excited to have this forum this evening, organized very quickly over the last couple of weeks, and I want to give thanks especially to the forum staff for working so hard to put this together. Tonight's forum is entitled Libya After the No-Fly Zone, Political Change or Civil War, and we're going to explore the issues that are on the front of minds of citizens all across the world. Now, last night we heard President Obama address the country and talk about what the rationale for the no-fly zone and the military invention. And we're going to talk about that as well as so many other issues this evening. Tonight's panel is going to be moderated by Professor Nicholas Burns. We have a distinguished panel of experts that he's going to introduce in turn. And when they're finished discussing, there'll be time for questions at the four microphones. So thank you all for coming. Looking forward to a great discussion. Professor Burns.
Thank you very much, Trey. Good evening, everyone. Pleasure to welcome all of you to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. We're going to discuss Libya tonight, specifically Libya after the imposition of the no-flight zone, after the UN Security Council resolution. We have very distinguished guests to discuss this and help us learn about this conflict tonight, specifically Ambassador Ali Suleiman Al-Jaouli, formerly Libyan ambassador to the United States, presently representative of the Provisional Government of Libya in the United States. Ambassador, welcome.
Thank you.
Pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you.
We also have two distinguished professors, Professor Dirk van der Velde from Dartmouth College, Hanover, New Hampshire, widely recognized as one of the foremost authorities in our country, really around the world, on Libya itself, its politics, its history, its sociology. He's become a bit of a media star. Over the last couple of weeks, we've seen him on television, heard him on the radio. I've been very impressed at his analysis, and we're looking forward, Professor, to your contribution this evening. And Professor Steve Walt, my good friend, longtime professor at the Kennedy School, astute analyst of U.S. foreign policy and international politics, and really pleased to have Professor Walt with us this evening. We meet at a time of extraordinary change in the Middle East. Boy, is that the understatement of the year. Since mid-January, since those initial events in Tunisia, we've seen what lots of people are calling the Arab awakening, or the Arab revolt, or individual revolts in each of the 22 Arab countries, all different. And we saw the encouraging, really inspiring images of young protesters protesting peacefully in Tunisia and in Egypt, in Tahrir Square. We've seen awakenings and revolts of a different type, a Sunni-Shia split in Bahrain that has turned violent, where the government has used its power against the Shia population, an internal conflict, a sort of a civil war in Yemen, an incipient revolt now in Syria, and I think dramatic events in each of the Arab countries. Libya, however, is in the international spotlight because peaceful protests were put down savagely by the Gaddafi regime. A rebel army rose. That army did quite well in its initial military offensive, but then beaten back by the Gaddafi forces. A last-minute Security Council resolution, a last-minute decision by the United States government, by President Obama, to join the international coalition, to intervene, to prevent the successful siege of Benghazi by Gaddafi's forces. And now we see the march westward of that rebel army, aided, I think, assisted by this coalition air force, and perhaps some climactic battles ahead in places like Sirte and perhaps even in Tripoli. How should we understand this conflict? Is there a way to arrest this conflict? Is there a way for Gaddafi to determine that perhaps there are no options left to him but to leave the country, or will he fight to the finish? Can this rebel army and its provisional government succeed in leading the people of Libya against the dictator in Tripoli? Lots of questions for us to answer. How should we who live outside of Libya respond to this? Are we neutral arbiters, or are we part of the drama itself? What is the role of the coalition? So lots of questions, and we hope lots of answers from this panel. We're going to have a discussion here for a little bit, for 30 or 40 minutes. I'll ask each of the panelists some questions. And then at around 6:45, we're going to open up the microphones. There are 4 of them. You're most welcome to ask a question. I'll give you some thoughts about how to ask a question successfully at the Kennedy School Forum when we get to that point. But first, let me just welcome Ambassador Al-Jaouli again to Cambridge and to Harvard University. We were really delighted when he accepted our invitation to be with us today. As you can imagine, he is in some demand. he's also under some pressure. He was the Libyan ambassador to our country. In fact, that's when we first met, when I was still working in the U.S. government. He made a very courageous decision and a very important decision, and it had worldwide repercussions when he resigned in protest, I think on the 21st of last month, in protest against the actions of Colonel Gaddafi and the Gaddafi government. That left him without an embassy staff. It left him without the support from his own country and capital, and he has become the representative of the provisional government in Benghazi. So he's here. I think we'll begin our questioning with the ambassador. Ambassador, I want to say welcome again, but let me ask you the first question. How did you arrive at that decision to leave your post and to take on this new responsibility for the provisional government? What led you to that?
Well,
very important.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. It was a very difficult decision to take, but Gaddafi made it very easy for me. Very easy. Because when I was watching what's going on in Benghazi, when the women screaming, asking for some help, and the people are helpless. They've been shot by every corner, and mercenaries from different African countries wearing a yellow caps and shooting without discrimination. And I asked myself, what's going on? I communicate with some friends in different embassies, and we've been consulting each other. What's happening in Libya? And then after 2 days, things is getting worse. On the 21st, then there was some announcement saying that Saif is going to make a speech.
Saif
Gaddafi, the son of the Colonel Gaddafi. Well, I said, maybe he presents himself as a democratic person, as a reformist, as the hope of the Libyan young, especially the young generation. And I was listening to the speech on the Libyan official channel, and I was just about to collapse when I heard what he is talking about. He left no option for the Libyans. Either this family rule them, or they kill them. Then I just went straight to Al Jazeera, and I said, I'm resigning from this regime who is killing his people without discrimination and without limit. That's how this has happened.
This was a speech when Saif al-Islam al-Gaddafi threatened that there would be rivers of blood in the country if the protesters did not subside.
Yeah, exactly. That's what he said. That if you're not going to stop this protest, then if you're going to go ahead with it, then the judge between you and us is the arms. Then there is no other choice, unfortunately. And I think not only inside Libya, the people were disappointed of Saif, who presented himself, as I mentioned before. He was wearing this mask for the last 15 years. And that's the last hope for the Libyan people. He'd been playing with their feeling, he'd been playing with their future, he'd been playing with their hopes for the last 15 years. And then I don't think that anybody with just some feeling for the Libyan people who've been suffering for 42 years under Gaddafi, that he will stay any more minute to serve this regime anymore.
So, Ambassador, 30 or 40 days ago, we saw protesters on the streets of Tripoli. And when those protesters were fired upon, when exaggerated force brutal force was used against them, this rebel army formed. Who are the leaders of that army? What do they believe? What are their ultimate objectives?
Well, I think the people who surround Gaddafi, they are relative, close relative, or the security service, the leader of security service, either from his family or from his tribe or from his close friends. This is the people who are with Gaddafi. But the point which we never expect to happen, the things we never expect to happen, that Gaddafi, he used mercenaries. He bring African mercenaries from Chad, from Kenya, and from Mali. And of course, Libya, it has a very big borders with these African countries, and they can bring them easily by land or by air. He's been using some mercenaries, unfortunately, even from Ukraine, to use them as a pilot to bring these mercenaries to Libya, because the Libyan pilots, they refuse to do that. Then this is the people Gaddafi is using to control the security and to use them. They are desperate people because they are with him. They are his right hand. They are the killer of the Libyan people. They have no place to go. Either they live with Gaddafi or die with him. then these people, they hate the Libyan people. Unfortunately, can you ever see that a leader calling his people rats? This I don't think has ever happened. Unfortunately, this gentleman, Gaddafi, he doesn't respect his people. Maybe you ask me a question, but why you serve this regime for 40 years if you don't believe in it? Well, I tell you, I don't think that every honest man in Libya, and there are many of them serving this regime, they're not serving Gaddafi, they're serving the people. I don't think it is the right thing that to leave the country open for him and for his forces to destroy our ambition and our dreams. Then when I came here to this country in 2004, there are many Libyan, 95% Arab position. We never discriminate with the Libyan community who is with Gaddafi or who is against Gaddafi. If I am from the Revolutionary Committee, that I have to investigate every request. But we never deny any passport. We never deny any legislation for any documents for any Libyan. In fact, we help them to go. Then for example, there are 4 or 5 people from the old government. The chairman of the council himself, Dr. Isawi, he was the professor of economy in the University of Garyunis. Dr. Mahmoud Jibril, he is a reformist, and they brought him to help to reform the economy. These 4 people, they brought by Saif, the son of Gaddafi, to reform Libya. But when they realized that they can't do anything, they try to draft the resolution, they try to reform the economy, they try to reform the juridical system. Nothing happened. Nothing happened. Then they resign. And then they resign and they do something else. I believe that these people, and there are many of them, they are part of this change. Correct me if I'm wrong, there is no change ever in the history that the old regime, some of the old regime is not part of it. Just for example, if you see Nasser revolution, then he was a captain in the army, the same thing with Gaddafi. Then some of these people, they have to be around. But the people who are, their hands are dirty with blood, they are corrupted people, that's the people they will not allow them. In the future, democratic Libya, I think Libya have to be open for all the people, but except the people who are in charge of killing Libyans, who abuse Libyans. That's the people they have to face their task, and they have to be presented to the court and fair court. Libya is a small country with a small population. A small country, not in size, but in the population is very small. And the Libyans are not very ambitious to jump on the seat of Mr. Gaddafi. They only want respect. They only want to feel that they're proud to be Libyan. They only feel they want some justice, and they want help for their future, for their children, for their grandchildren. That's what they're asking. They don't mind if Gaddafi stays 100 years, as far as he's doing this. But unfortunately, this is not what's going on in Libya. What's going on in Libya is completely the opposite. Libya now, if you compare Libya with other countries in the Gulf, we are 20 years behind. Why? We have the wealth, we have the brains, but we don't have, with the Libyans, they don't have a chance to say what they want and to ask what the government, what are you doing? It is a historical moment for the Libyan to get rid of this regime.
Ambassador, you've had 30 days to put together a provisional government and a rebel army. Have you had time inside that government? You're now represented here in the United States. And I know there was a manifesto or a communique issued today by that government to put together a common platform for what you would like to achieve should you gain power. Is there a common ideology, whether you're pro-market or pro-central planning? Are you going to be a member of the Arab League? Will you want to cooperate with Egypt? What is the basic political unity in this provisional government, if there is one?
Yeah, let me tell you, this statement was made today. I think it is an excellent statement. I think the Council, for the first time, able to tell the Libyan people and what they are going to do. I'm sorry. That's the last thing I expect.
If it's important, you can...
No.
If it's from Tripoli, you should take the call.
There is nothing important than this meeting, it is to talk to you and to enjoy talking to you. Then the council, they presented a roadmap today. What they want to do, they want to get together. They want to have prepare for the draft the constitution. They also emphasize on the multi-party system. They also emphasize for the Libyan they are free to express their freedom, the freedom of speech. They also express that the freedom for forming the non-government organization. They also want to have to be, of course, member of the Arab League, member of the African Union, because we are an African, we are an Arab in this. But in the same time, what is they emphasize on that Libya, a democratic Libya, a new Libya. They need a lot of help, not only during this difficult time, but also they need help after Gaddafi is out. They need help from friendly country. And believe me, Libyan will never forget what the stand of the United States. You stand with us in a very critical time. And Gaddafi only afraid, believe me, of US because he knows if they hit, they can hit strong. Then your stand with the Libyan people, it is great. You have to help him in peace and war. Now I think we will be able to speak more frank, we will speak with confidence, we will speak with friendship, we'll speak for one thing, that to help the Libyan people to get rid of this regime. And then when we put our plan and put our priority, I think that we will achieve our goals in a very short time. When we get our independence in 51, we have 56 Libyan graduated from university. That's all what we have. In 18 years, the monarchy, they achieved more than Gaddafi achieved in 42 years. This government, Libyan, they are talking to each other. They want to preserve their unity. This is very important. We never allow Gaddafi that to separate Libya, Tripoli, or East and West. This is very important, and we want the help of the international community to help us. We want, of course, also that to exercise our right as a democratic country. If Gaddafi stays behind, it is a very dangerous. Now he's just like an injury animal put in the corner. He's been hitting Libyan in peace. What about war? He will hit the West more than he will hit the Libyans, because he's the man of revenge. As I mentioned to you, Nick, when, for example, they control cities, okay, you control this city, people, they are in their houses, they don't leave them alone. And he made this is in his speech, that house to house, street by street, then he killing people wherever he get them. This is the history will be finished. Now, I hope that we'll get rid of this man very soon, and I think there is no Libyans divided among that. They have a democratic country, they have a free election, they have free of press, and they want to be friends, and they want something is very important. They want to get their dignity, and they want to be proud of their country. You don't know how much we are humiliated when we travel from country to another, and you're holding a Libyan passport, and you give it to the immigration officer, and he look at you from top to bottom. Because of the reputation, unfortunately, Libyan gained for the last 30 years. We accusing of bombing, accusing of killing, accusing of terrorist action. Then I'm very optimistic. And I think the Libyan will never give a chance for any extremist movement to take after Gaddafi. Don't believe the Gaddafi propaganda. Don't believe that Al-Qaeda is there. Al-Qaeda not in Libya. Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. In Pakistan, maybe, but not in Libya. They have no place to hide in Libya. And maybe the only thing good Gaddafi did during this time, that Al-Qaeda was not in Libya. Libya, it will be a new member, a new democratic country in the world after a long suffering under Gaddafi regime.
Thank you, Ambassador. Two quick questions before we go on to Professor Vandervelde. Can the rebels win? Can they defeat Gaddafi on the battlefield?
Well, look, Gaddafi, he has all the arms. Thank you to the coalition, they paralyzed his superiority on the air. But the opposition, they have problem with weapons. They need weapons. Even the range of their weapons is short. The quality of weapons they have is not really compared with the Gaddafi have. They need good supply. And I don't think that the correlation will help Libya until the middle of the road, and then they'll say, okay, this is your task, you have to challenge it. I think this is a very important issue. We don't want boots on the Libyan soil. That will be not good for us, not good for you. Not American or European whatsoever. Yeah. But I emphasize on helping Libyans' resistance, because It was start with a very simple demonstration, no weapons, nothing. And then they find themselves, they are facing the mercenaries with submachine guns. Can you imagine that he hit his own people with the missiles against tanks? The injuries, the people we see in the hospital, it is unbelievable. Then I'm 100% sure, Nick, then the opposition will win, because Gaddafi has no support. Gaddafi is just some people, he pay them, and they will leave him at a certain point. But two things, the coalition must be united, and the Libyan must be helped. We will achieve our goals.
Should the United States and the NATO alliance arm the rebels, and are you asking the U.S. to do that?
Of course. This is one of my first messages, that they should help them. Not only with that, maybe with some people to train them, to help them. And this is important, like humanitarian assistance to help Libyan with the armament is very important. And I want you to be sure, we don't want to charge the taxpayer of anything. Libya has a lot of money. Just here in the United States, we have more than $30 billion. Then we will take care of our costs. But we need the help. Our money is frozen. It is here 30 billion. I don't have 1 cent now in my account, of the embassy account or the short accounts. And the money is there. The money has been frozen. When we have an access to that, then I think we will be able to pay our bill.
Ambassador, final question. You've known Colonel Gaddafi for a long time. Tell us your impression of him. Is he rational? Is he mad? Is he likely to elect, if he's isolated and perhaps about to be defeated, to leave Libya to end this civil war, or is he going to fight to the last with his sons? What kind of person is he?
Well, let me...
How will we see him react?
Yeah, let me tell you, Nick, people, the ordinary people, or maybe this is what the people believe, that the ambassador of any country in the United States, that he have a very special relation with the president. This is not the case with me, at least. I am the professional diplomat who brought me here, not Gaddafi, not because of my relation with Gaddafi, because they thought I am the one who can help to build the relation, to rebuild the confidence between Libya and the United States. Then I met Gaddafi in a very small group twice. One was in 2009 when he came to United Nations, and I was in charge of organizing his trip and taking care of it. And the second one when he went to Libya in last year, and that was in May. On 2 occasions, Gaddafi told me this. He told me, I don't know you, but the people speak very highly of you. Then my relation to Gaddafi is not really a strong, friendly relation. But what I hear from the people, what I read from his action, Gaddafi is a very difficult man. He is very smart, he is very intelligent, and he doesn't forget. And if he revenge, he can hit very hard. You can't trust him at all. He can play any games you like. And he act opposite, exactly opposite what he showed to the people. And his problem that he believes that he is a writer, he is a thinker, he is the king of kings, he is God on the earth. And if God on the earth, how can you tell him that this is maybe wrong? Can you tell God you are wrong? You cannot tell him. Then, unfortunately, he act his own. Nobody can discuss even very stupid orders given to them to carry it on. They will ask how they carry the order. He has no sense of democracy at all. He has no sense of compassion at all. He has no sense of respect for the Libyan at all. This is kind of Gaddafi. That's kind of person. He's a very strange person. And he's the only one, he's the only Libyan to hang Libyan after Mussolini. Mussolini, Italy, when they occupied Libya, they hung the Libyan in the street. Yes, but the second one who hung the Libyan in the street is their own one who claimed that he's the leader of the Libyan people. Then can you imagine this? He believed only in revenge and in power. But dialogue does not exist in his thoughts or his policy.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And thanks very much for your clarity and for your openness to these questions.
Thank you.
Professor Vandervelde, so there's a lot to ask you. Could I just pick up on this last question?
Sure.
You've studied Libya. What kind of person is this? And do you think he's likely to try to achieve a military victory or at least a stalemate over the rebel alliance? Or could he be open to a proposal that maybe he should just leave if that's possible, to leave and not be indicted at some future point by the ICC?
I think Gaddafi is very much somebody who comes out of a tribal ethos within Libya. That is that when you listen carefully to his speeches over the last 40 years, incidentally, they have not wavered, and the ambassador is absolutely right. You can listen to his speech he said in 1971 when he came to power, when he was talking about Arab nationalism, and eventually that language about Arab nationalism changed. But the very basic image that Gaddafi has of himself is in a sense the reincarnation, if you want, of Omar al-Mukhtar. And you may remember when he went to Italy a few months ago on his last visit that he had pinned to his lapel of his suit a picture of Omar al-Mukhtar. And of course he wanted to rub it into the Italians that they had hanged Omar al-Mukhtar and that no one would play the same game with him that they played with Omar al-Mukhtar. So he's very much in a tribal tradition. He sees himself as a martyr, very much in the Libyan tradition, in the tradition of Omar al-Mukhtar. And so when the ambassador says, in a sense, that there's no compromise possible, that's exactly right. And this is somebody who truly believes, first of all, that he does represent the true voice, first of all, of the Arabs, and when that faltered, of the Africans, sub-Saharan Africans. And as the ambassador also said, if you live in that kind of self-reverential world for so long, where no one ever really questions you, you come to believe what you say all the time. And so it's uncompromising. And when he said in that interview, when the uprising started in February, that he would fight, as also Saif al-Islam said, to the last bullet, I truly believe him. I think this is someone who will indeed go to the wall, I believe. Now, we know that Italy today has proposed a kind of a political solution whereby he would be willing, he would be able to leave the country eventually, a kind of a special gateway created toward one of the countries that obviously does not accept the International Criminal Court, because then he would be in serious trouble. But of course, there are a few countries like that. And of course, the question is whether or not he will do that. My hunch is he will probably not. I think he will stay in Libya until the very end. So very non-compromising, tribal in outlook in many ways, and therefore I think there until the very end.
Thank you. Professor, give us your best sense of what's likely to happen now. It looks like, but this is just over the last 36 hours, that the rebel advance west has met some resistance. Gaddafi is still strong in Sirte and certainly in Tripoli. Do you fear the possibility of a protracted civil war, a stalemate, where neither side is strong enough to win outright?
In many ways, I think the easy part of the fighting is over in Libya. And that is, as the troops, the rebels, move westward, they are now getting into territory that at least has had some support for Gaddafi, and particularly as he gets into Tripoli, even more support. But I'm not sure in the end that is what is truly important here in terms of a civil war, because it seems to me that what will determine whether or not Libya slips into a civil war will have to do with the international coalition. Remember that Carter Ham has said that the opposition would not stand up against the Gaddafi's forces if they were left alone. So that means that, in a sense, the international coalition has a number of choices here that it needs to make. If it supports the rebels, that means very likely eventually that they will take all of Libya. If, on the other hand, they play very strictly according to Resolution 1973, then they cannot go against civilians. And what do you do if you have civilians, pro-Gaddafi civilians, in Sirte, let's say, and in Tripoli, who do not want international intervention? So it leads to a number of kind of conundrums, I think, that the international community has not decided upon. But ultimately, I think the international community, by the decision that it takes in Libya, will decide whether or not the country will go toward a civil war. And I think, even though officially we may not be able to take certain actions, I think it is very clear from what we've heard, both from President Obama, from so many Europeans as well, that even though we may not have the mandate to effectively bring about regime change, that there are all kinds of measures that we're willing to support that would eventually bring that about.
So what's your best guess, and you've asked the key question, is the coalition, NATO, going to be an independent referee, or is it going to continue to be the Air Force for the Rebel Alliance, as it's been over the last 10 days? That's the key question. What's going to happen? Who's going to win this war?
Well, again, depending on, I think we'll probably see, and we've already seen an enormous amount of debates, and I should say this is really more Steve's bailiwick than mine, but we've already seen a number of very hard debates on that particular issue and how precisely the different forces should weigh in. My hunch, and we should also keep in mind, of course, that the United States in many ways, despite the fact that it wants to be seen as taking a secondary role, has really been the major suppliers of the hardware and the technology and so on that makes the that has sustained the uprising until now. My hunch is that the Europeans will probably eventually agree and with the United States decide very coherently to move forward.
In support of the Rebel Alliance.
In support of the Rebel Alliance.
So let's say, just for the purposes of this discussion, let's say at some point in the future, weeks or months ahead, the Rebel Alliance does achieve a military victory. Gaddafi is defeated or he leaves. What is that government likely to be like? And we'll come back and give the ambassador a chance to answer this as well. But what kind of governing philosophy, what kind of an Arab country, what kind of relationship with the U.S.?
That, I think, is the most difficult question, of course, that Libya faces. And I should say, and let me pick up on a couple of the issues that the ambassador mentioned. I think, first of all, you have to realize this is a country that for 42 years has had no real institutions of state to speak of. As the ambassador said, this was a very personalized regime. Even the close circle of support around Gaddafi is primarily family, some tribal alliances and so on, but a very close-knit circle. And so it seems to me that one of the things that will need to happen before anything else, and again the ambassador hinted at that in many ways, is some kind of process of reconciliation in Libya. And here, of course, the international community, the United States to some extent, can help very dramatically. But we have to realize this is essentially a tribal society. And it's a tribal society that has for 42 years very deliberately been kept in a kind of divide and rule fashion by Gaddafi to achieve his own purposes. If you add to that the historical differences between the two provinces, between the two most important provinces, Tripolitania and Cyrenaica, what in a sense you have is really a recipe for disaster. Because you can think about this very carefully, and of course today we have seen a statement by the National Alliance that was put out, a two-page statement, very eloquent, laying out what the opposition sees as the groundwork for Libya. And of course, not surprising, the word democracy features very prominently in that document. But the question you have to ask yourself is, how likely is democracy in a country that doesn't even have the very basic institutions of what democratic systems need to sustain themselves? And so from that point of view, I think the Libyans have an enormous amount of work to do, and hopefully in a unified fashion, before they can even start thinking about a modern democracy, the way we in the West, the kind of liberal democracy that we in the West take for granted.
Thank you, and we'll go back to you for some follow-up questions, but I want to bring Professor Walt into this conversation. Steve, so you're our analyst of how the United States is doing and the choices that President Obama has made, right or wrong. Was the president right to join the coalition and lift the siege of Benghazi? He spent most of his time in the speech last night defending that decision. Correct in hindsight? Incorrect?
If it had been up to me, I would not have done it. And I think what we're seeing now is the administration, having committed itself on a course of action whose outcome is uncertain, is now going to be carried along by the logic of some of those decisions it's already made. What you saw last night from President Obama was, just as you said, an attempt to defend this decision, but to walk a very fine line. On the one hand, trying to convince the American people that there really were vital interests involved, that the United States is a special country with special responsibilities, that there was a potential humanitarian crisis there of sufficient magnitude that it justified American action. So making the positive case for why we had to do something, but at the same time trying to reassure everyone who's concerned that this is open-ended, that the UN mandate doesn't go as far as we may be trying to take it, is concerned that the United States is still in Iraq, is still fighting a war in Afghanistan, is concerned that once again the United States ends up doing all the heavy lifting, even though you have a few other members of a coalition helping out. So he was trying to sort of walk that very narrow line of saying, this is really important, we had to do it, but it's not going to be that hard, it's not going to take that long, I'm not going to send any ground troops, so don't worry about the potential downside here. If they're lucky, and this works out as they're hoping it will, namely, by intervening, they have turned the tide, and gradually Gaddafi's forces will start to melt away. They'll sort of see what the writing on the wall. His loyalty won't be that powerful. His loyal supporters won't be that powerful. Eventually, he'll either agree to go or he'll be left without any support. And you don't get a stalemate. You don't get a civil war. The danger, of course, is if that doesn't happen, if, in fact, he decides to fight to the bitter end and he can keep enough people around him to make it a real fight, then the United States and its allies face a whole series of very awkward choices. How long do you stay in the game? Do you start sending ground forces? Do you send special forces? Do you arm the rebels? And if lots of people start dying as a result of what's happening on the ground, what was originally justified as a humanitarian operation to save lives doesn't look like a humanitarian operation any longer. My guess at that point is then you really do have to worry about the coalition starting to splinter a little bit. The British will say, you know, we're out of money. The French will say, well, we were willing to take this a certain distance, but maybe not all the way. The whole management of the coalition, as we saw, say, in Kosovo, becomes much harder if it takes longer than they are crossing their fingers and hoping it will.
Right. I thought that the President made a very articulate, even very eloquent defense of our humanitarian obligation to go into Benghazi, that in the first part of the speech. What was absent from the second part of the speech was any focus on the issues you just raised. If there is a protracted civil war, are we referee or are we taking the side of the rebels? And if you're a member of the coalition, say a young lieutenant or captain or a private fighting, do you understand what the mission is and what success is and what the end state is?
Actually,
Is that a problem from your perspective?
Well, I actually thought the speech was disingenuous on this point because he said explicitly that we're not going to use our military forces to oust the regime, right? And of course, he kind of has to say that because the UN resolution that justifies this it doesn't talk about doing that. It doesn't authorize us to do it.
Right.
But I think it's clear from the statements that the President has made in other contexts, from the statements of other members of his administration, and from what the American military is actually doing, we are, in fact, attempting to use our military to pave a road for the rebel army and to persuade his forces to abandon him. And this was actually laid out quite clearly by a couple of American military officials in the New York Times today. So there's a little bit of a gap between the explicit reassurances that we're not attempting regime change with military force and I think what we're actually doing on the ground. And that's because, again, I think the administration realizes that the best outcome here is a rapid transition of power, not a long and protracted and potentially bloody civil war.
In that sense, it may be a strategy of hope rather than design.
There is, I think, one other potential sort of longer-term danger, and I haven't thought this one through, but I do worry about if we are stretching the Security Council resolution maybe to the breaking point, what happens the next time you go to the Security Council and you want to get authorization for a humanitarian operation? Because there will be another next time at some point down the road, and other members of the Security Council say, well, we remember the last time we authorized...
for instance, China.
Right. Last time we authorized one of these, you took it all the way to Tripoli.
Right.
Right. So my guess is that concern is not front and center in the minds of the White House right now. They would just like to find a way to get out of this one as quickly as possible.
Before we go to questions from the audience, two more quick questions for you, Steve. You and I both know NATO. I thought it was interesting in the last few days to see the administration say the United States is stepping back and NATO is stepping forward. The problem with that is that the United States is the backbone, the heart, the soul, and the military provider of NATO. Is it possible for NATO to exist on the front lines without the United States being on the front lines?
I think probably not, and particularly if things go quickly, right? If a week and a half from now Gaddafi is out of Tripoli, he's on his way somewhere else, then yes, then this issue sort of never arises. But I think there will be a point at which the British will tell you that, you know, sorry, if we're going to drop any more bombs for you, you're going to have to provide the bombs. And in fact, we're starting to run out of money here. because this is costing us $25 million a day, and we don't have it. If you've checked our, it's not clear we have it either, but so I can see, in a sense, if this is a success, NATO will get some credit, and the United States will get a lot of credit for it, in fact, most of the credit. But if this goes south, the United States will, I think, end up getting most of the blame as well.
Right. Final question for you, Steve. The Italians floated this proposal today. Gaddafi should go to some country, third country, and live in exile. The Turks have been talking about a Turkish-mediated ceasefire. For what ultimate end, I'm not quite sure. Is there a diplomatic play here, a diplomatic angle that could stop the war and produce a result that everybody could live with?
Yeah.
Gaddafi leaves by peaceful means, not by violent means.
It's hard for me to imagine, given how far we've gone rhetorically, it's hard for me to imagine that the United States or the coalition could accept a solution in which he's still in place. I don't see that in the cards. And the difficulty is, how do you give him an exit deal that he regards as credible? After all, you're driving him out of power with air power, basically, by violence. He has no reason to trust the Western community at all. What we've already heard about his personality suggests he wouldn't be very trusting at that point. And even if we say, look, you can go to this country, we'll leave you alone, the ICC will never come after you, how can he be sure that in a year from now we don't then put a lot of pressure on that government to finally cough him up so he stands trial for war crimes? It's very difficult to persuade him that we'll really leave him alone, having spent a considerable amount of time demonizing him in driving him out of power. So I think it's going to be hard to arrange that. You might be able to pull it off. But,
I doubt it. But we were talking before we came out here today about this question. The International Criminal Court is now a real force in the world if you're an authoritarian dictator. Is there a country in the world of 192 nation states that Gaddafi could go to and think to himself, the ICC can't reach me? Is there one country?
Well, the United States didn't ratify the International
But we're
Criminal
not that
Court agreement, so he would be immune from it here, but I somehow don't think he'll show up anytime.
I think that's right. Is there any other country that he could go to where that would not, even if it wasn't a member of the ICC, not submit to an extradition document of the ICC?
I think it's very hard to imagine. There might be one or two. I can't think of one. Someone in the audience may have a good
countries.
Okay, we've got a few. Zimbabwe, North Korea were two.
That's right.
Venezuela might be a third, Carl. Okay, great discussion from three experts. We thank all of you for your openness, candor, and intelligence. Let's go to the microphones here, there, and there. First come, first serve. Just a couple of rules. One question per person. We welcome dissent and alternative views, but in a polite way, obviously. And your question must end with a question mark attached to it. And just please give us your name and what you're studying here at the school. Thank you.
Sure. My name is Mark Hannes. I'm not a student. I work for an advocacy organization that just merged called Save Darfur and Genocide Intervention Network. And the question to the panel is looking at the revenue stream that's propping up the Gaddafi regime. We know with the U.S. pretty successfully, quickly, comprehensively putting a asset freeze on the $33 billion and other countries following suit. But we still saw some ongoing revenues, and the news came out today or yesterday that the government of Qatar offered to provide the auspices for the rebels to get the revenue streams. I'm curious if you think that, well, one, is there some way to ensure that there's accountability for the government of Qatar to make sure that those oil revenues are actually going to responsible means? And if not, would you support a UN-authorized escrow account that we've seen being used with the World Bank and Chad to ensure that these revenues would not be used to harm people?
Ambassador. Yes, and whether or not the government of Qatar can be an adequate transition point for assets to the rebel alliance.
Well, freeze and asset, this is one of the very important issue, and we've been talking with the Department of Treasury and State Department, and there is some good idea how to deal with the frozen assets. But still the problem that's the recognition of the council. Now we have only 2 countries recognize the council. The provisional council, yeah, that's what I mean. Then if there is enough recognition of the council, then probably he has some access to use this money. But the idea now we discussed with the lawyers, that they have maybe to appoint a trustee. The trustee, then he will be in charge of this until the regimes fall. If the regimes fall, then the council automatically will be deal with this. It is a very technical issue, and there are so many explanations and so many experts there try to deal with this. The United States government, they want very much for the council to use this assets because we need this money very much. We need it for the humanitarian. We need it for the education. We have about 2,000 students here. We have just enough money for them until the end of this month. What's going to happen to them? Then we've been discussing this issue very closely with different departments in the United States, but still I cannot tell you that we will have maybe a resolution tomorrow or after tomorrow. It is a matter of time and matter of courage is how to take the decision. Sometimes we stick to the very small points in the law and in the Vienna Convention, and we stuck by that. But I think this is a very important issue, and we're working on it with the government of the United States. And the same thing it will be with other countries like Britain. We have another $30 billion, 30 billion euro you see in the banks.
Ambassador, you mentioned two countries that have recognized the Council, France
and Qatar.
And Qatar are the two.
Yes.
Do you expect others to recognize you? Do you expect the Obama administration to recognize you officially?
Well, I think if Obama decided to join the coalition to save the lives and he stands by the American values, and I think the recognition of the Council, this is a very important point for our march toward democracy and towards to get rid of this regime. Because if we have more recognition, then the regime will get more frustrated, and maybe he will be able, or he will accept that he will leave the country without more bloodshed. Then the recognition of the Council is a very essential. If you want to get in law discussion and philosophy discussion, we'll never get out. This decision has to be made like for France. For example, France, they recognize the Council. On what basis they recognize the Council? They have legal basis to do that. Then if France can do it, I think the United States can do it too.
Thank you. Professor, you have a view on this?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a word of caution here. What we've seen is that the United States, and I think very rightly so, has been very, very careful in handling this transitional council, in part because, of course, it does not represent Libya as a whole. And if this conflict were ever settled, Tripolitanians wouldn't be very happy about the recognition of a council that only represents part of the country. So we're facing a real dilemma there in many ways. You've probably seen that Mahmoud Jibril was deliberately kept at the sidelines of the conference in London this morning, particularly for that reason, because we don't want to be seen as recognizing a government that is only national in its avocation at this point and not truly representing the country. So there's all kinds of legal issues there.
So you see this as a council that essentially represents the eastern geographic part of Libya, not Tripoli.
There is some infiltration of Tripolitanians into the council, but essentially it's overwhelmingly an eastern-based council at this point.
And Ambassador, very quickly, is that a fair criticism?
No, I don't think it is not fair, because the council now have 31 members. This member represent the free cities of Libya. The rest of the member from the western part, which still Gaddafi, if not control them, he can reach them. Then the council being recognized by most of the tribes in the west, from, for example, Bani Walid, from Zawiya, from Zintan, from Tripoli, from Misrata, then the recognition of the council as a sole representative of the Libyan people, not only limited to the eastern part, which the cities being liberated, it is all over Libya is being recognized. Then if this council be recognized over Libya, but they have to keep the names, as I mentioned, that they cannot announce them, then I think this is a good question to ask why, for example, Arab countries, why Western countries, they should not recognize this. Except if there is still some reservation about, it's still the Qaeda, and we go to the same story again. And we said the Qaeda does not exist in Libya. And I can tell you exactly, I have some discussion with the high authority here in the United States, and they tell me exactly that this propaganda about Al-Qaeda is nobody's believe it. Then the council is represent the whole Libya, not only the eastern part is liberated by the opposition.
Thank you very much. It was a great question. Mrs. Fulbright, welcome to this conversation.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that 50 years ago I lived in Seoul, Korea when Syngman Rhee was ousted, which was at first a very euphoric situation. I was working at a newspaper and also at a college there, and people were just ecstatic until reality set in. And, you know, they had a very hard road towards democracy because there were certainly no structures, no understanding of it, and a few big egos that wanted to take over the country. So I was just wondering what Libya can do to smooth the road, to make it a lot easier than what I watched 50 years ago.
The road to democracy.
The road to real democracy, to participatory government, to councils that mean something, to an educated public that can vote sensibly, and so forth.
Who would like to take that on?
Well, as you know, Libyans, they are very thirsty, they are very hungry for democracy. They haven't practiced democracy for a long time. Of course, it will not be an easy process to set up the institution. Gaddafi left no institution in Libya. All the institution, it is act according his wishes and his will. There is no democracy representation at all. It will be not an easy task, but Libyans, they have no other choice. And this is the choice with no one Libyan, they will say no. Libyans, they want a free country, they want to practice democracy, they have to set up their institution. In the old regime, the monarchy regime, we have a Senate, we have a lower house, what they call it, and we have, for example, the minister, they're not elected among the peoples. The minister has been appointed, but they have to be approved by the councils. Then I think that we are able and we are capable to pick up the right direction toward the democracy. No Libyan in Libya, they will fight to set up a democratic system in Libya. There is no one like that. But you have to be patient with us. And you, as I said, you have to help us not only during the crisis, but during the peace.
Thank you. Professor, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I guess I'm a little more pessimistic, in part because, as I said, and state building is really my academic specialty. You know, I tend to think again that you need to have a number of preparatory institutions before you can really move, and I think the ambassador, you know, acknowledges that implicitly, that there are, you know, lots of difficulties, obviously, after 40, I mean, not just 40 years, because for all practical purposes, even the monarchy in many ways, we shouldn't forget that the monarchy also abolished elections in 1952 in Libya. So they've now had 60 years in a sense of being completely not represented at all. So to rebuild that, I think, will take an enormous amount of time and skill. And that's another reason why I'm still a little bit more pessimistic, I think, than the ambassador is. I don't see any real national figures yet emerging that could really take Libya on the path of that. Now, of course, that doesn't mean they will not emerge, obviously, but to kind of go further a little bit, and here again, I would very strongly agree with the ambassador. I think here is an ideal chance for the international community where there's an enormous amount of expertise on political governance, and also in the United States, you know, to go into Libya and help that process of reconciliation, of building the institutions that will be necessary for Libya truly to become a democracy. My personal look on this always is that in the West, we're always fixated on this notion that you need, you know, national elections 6 months after a revolution. And a lot of times...
Egypt, for instance.
Exactly. And unless you get those first stepping stones in place, it becomes very difficult. You can see a lot of backlash. So I think particularly some Libyans that I know are also very aware of that, and I think will urge a much more cautious and slow approach, eventually go into elections, but certainly not on the kind of timetable that perhaps we in the West would like to see.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Jack Porter, Treasurer of the International Association of Genocide Scholars. I think that, by the way, Gaddafi is more akin to Hitler than to Mussolini, and that more likely he'll bring down an Armageddon or hopefully a suicide. But the question I have for the ambassador and the panelists is, how deep is the support for Gaddafi? Or will, if Gaddafi dies, will the support collapse? and the struggle will not last long. So how deep and wide is the support for Gaddafi?
That's an excellent question. Could I just add to it for the ambassador and the others? Even if Gaddafi leaves, he has 7 sons that are very important members of the national security establishment. Could they carry on a pro-Gaddafi government without Gaddafi?
Unlike Hitler.
Well, I don't think that any Libyan, they would like to see any of Gaddafi's families back to inherit their father. They tell us they are the same copy. Saif, he is the man who presents himself as a democratic man, as a man with thoughts, as a man with graduated from London Economic Faculty, and he presents himself. You saw him, what did he tell the Libyans on the 21st of this month? Gaddafi, his family, his close friend, they will never be accepted in Libya to carry on their father's policy.
So the support is very weak.
I'm sorry?
The support is very shallow.
What support for?
The support for Gaddafi is shallow, he asked. Is it shallow? Is it not deep?
There is no support for Gaddafi at all. Gaddafi, the only thing support him is the weapons, nothing more than that. But among the people, the only people who are supporting Gaddafi, the close circle that he used them to kill and abuse the Libyans. And that they have no other escape. They die with him and they live with him. Look, there is no compromise for the Libyan people. There is no compromise for the family to stay. There is no compromise for Gaddafi to stay. Either the Libyan people win this fight toward the democracy, or either Gaddafi, he kill majority of them and he keep the Libyan under his regime for the rest of their lives. God knows.
Steve, do you want to jump in
Just
here?
very quickly, if there's no compromise with Gaddafi, and I think that's probably true, then there are not very many options for him and his family, which means they're much more likely to fight this to the very end. And it's, I think, clear just from what's happening on the battlefield that they do have troops that are still obeying orders, that are still fighting quite effectively, and may continue to do so for quite some time, whether they're mercenaries from Africa or whatever. The danger that it seems to me we are facing here is the possibility that if that is what happens, they decide to fight this to the bitter end and doing this in populated areas, that the humanitarian cost may exceed what we thought we were trying to prevent when we went in. And that, of course, is the danger when you intervene in any kind of civil conflict. You can't be entirely sure that you're going to get a swift, rapid, and relatively cost-free outcome.
Professor Dirk.
I just wanted to add that I think the ambassador is absolutely right. I think the Gaddafi family goes together. I mean, you know, Saif al-Islam was always seen as this reformer. I should say, seen mostly as a reformer by the West, and we build him up as the reformer because he kind of exemplified the image that we wanted to have of, you know, kind of a modernizing Arab son of the dictator. You know, there was not much to it. So I think the family itself is gone. I would be a little more cautious in terms of support. If you watched very carefully how the tribes were weighing in during this uprising, they weren't uniformly coming out in favor or against either the rebels or the Gaddafi government. A lot of them are sitting on the fence, and my hunch is that once this is played out, once Gaddafi goes, that we'll see a lot of this kind of fence-sitting. People are going to start taking sides, and it may not be quite as pretty as we think.
Thank you very much for your question. Yes.
Hi, Janine Jacob, a student here at the Kennedy School. My question is about public opinion of the United States on the ground. There's this perception that the United States missed the boat in terms of their ambiguous support in Egypt, and that really hurt U.S. credibility on the ground, and that this might be a way for the United States to elevate its credibility in the Middle East and throughout the Muslim world in general. Do you think that that is the case now in Libya and throughout the rest of the Middle East, or do you think this is seen as another type of realpolitik move that the United States is doing?
Steve, do you agree with that? Was that a major factor for President Obama?
I think that it was clear from Obama's speech yesterday, and I believe this has been true now for the last couple of weeks, that they believed what was happening in Libya could cast a very dark shadow over what the United States had somewhat gradually come to see as a positive set of events throughout the Arab world. I actually believe the administration responded relatively well to what was happening in Egypt. It obviously is the kind of thing you don't prepare for. It causes lots of anxiety when something like that begins to happen, but they did begin to realize where the winds were blowing and they got behind them. So I think in that sense, they did reasonably well. What I think the ultimate effect here depends a great deal on the outcome. It's really less what Obama said last night than rather whether this looks like a successful decision made with some international support leading to a reasonably favorable outcome. Then everyone will give themselves high fives, and this will redound positively in the Arab world and elsewhere. If things go badly, however, it's likely, I think, to be seen through the sort of traditional framework of another Western intervention in the Arab world that led to the deaths of innocents, etc. And in that sense, I worry we actually may have hurt ourselves if things don't go as well as we hope they do.
Thank you. Yes?
Hi, I'm Matt Noyes, a student here at the Kennedy School as well. If I could ask a rather similar question to the previous one. The Arab League called for the no-fly zone, the UN Security Council resolution, and some of the member states made very strong statements that not even the Prophet Muhammad ruled for 42 years, Gaddafi must go. But 3 days after the bombing started, the Secretary of the Arab League called to reconsider their support for the UN Security Council resolution. So I ask, what needs to be done to maintain the support of the Arab League and the Arab Street for the intervention in Libya?
Thank you for the question. I think the statement of the Arab League the Saturday before the Security Council resolution, I think, was the critical factor in turning Secretary Clinton around and then President Obama. It was surprising and ironic that the Arab League would call for the United States military to interfere, if you will, in the sovereign affairs of another Arab country. But how to keep that Arab coalition together, I think only Qatar and the United Arab Emirates are actually participating in the military operation. Gentlemen, and Ambassador, you too.
Well,
good question. You stumped the panel.
Yeah. Well, this is the first time in the Arab League history that they stand by the people. And not surprising the West, but it's surprising us. And I must say that we are very grateful to some countries who play a very important role to bring the Arabs together to decide that they will stand by the request presented by Libya. The situation in the Arab world now is very critical, is very dangerous, and I think the Arab League, they find themselves, they have to respond to the request of the people. And as Nick said, it is very critical for the West also, and for the United States and for other countries to come and to respond through the United Nations Security Council, and that security resolution is very important. We just want to mention one thing, that I don't think that it will be the same reaction against the American and the European intervention in Libya if you compare, for example, with Iraq or with Afghanistan. It is completely different issues. Libyan, they are the one who ask for the intervention because they are facing the Gaddafi's machine. And on the Friday 18th, I've been called by the chairman of the council, and I've been called by Dr. Ali Isawi, the foreign minister, or who is acting as a foreign minister. They're calling me then, please tell the American that they should do something, because the resolution of the United Nations at that time is already agreed on. And besides that, I have received calls from friends I know, because Gaddafi's forces are there. Then the response of the United States and the role the United States they play in this coalition is unforgettable, and you stop the massacre. That if this has not happened, if not the coalition didn't strike, then today we'll speak about the third massacre in the history of the human being.
Now, this is an important point. Some of the critics of President Obama have been out, American critics have been out saying that there wasn't assuredly going to be a massacre, that this has been inflated. Do you disagree with that, Ambassador? Speak to that a minute.
Yeah, it is really.
In Benghazi.
It is really a massacre because Gaddafi, he brought forces, tanks, and not to destroy Benghazi, but he is willing to, he can destroy the whole eastern part of Libya, that from Benghazi to Marij, to Darna, to Tobruk, and until to the border. And as I give two things that the council and the people, they are called me. And my relative in Benghazi also, they are calling me. And they thought, oh, I am the one who gave the order to the coalition to strike. But thank God that the strike came just in the right time, only about 3 hours, far from the Gaddafi forces, far from Benghazi. And if you take a car to drive from Benghazi to what they call it, to Jdabia, was about 160 miles, you will see between between vehicles and tank, there is a tank. The whole line that they are moving steadily with all the power they have to destroy this two city. Then a massacre has been stopped and the life has been saved.
And that was the armored column that Britain, France, and the United States bombed in the first 2 days.
Yeah, especially the first on the 19th, this of September,
right.
March 19 exactly.
Right. Steve?
This is a great question, and I would just, I guess, encourage everyone to remember that although Libya is in the headlines right now and it's the most vigorous response the United States has made to recent developments in the Arab world, how the United States appears to Arab peoples will be shaped not just by what happens in Libya, by what happens in Egypt and how we respond to that, whether the United States can rebuild a somewhat frayed relationship with Saudi Arabia and encourage the Gulf states to move in the direction of political reform, which I think we would like them to do in spite of what's happened there, whether the United States has policies in other parts of the world or other parts of the region, including the Israel-Palestine issue, that now becomes somewhat more palatable to Arab peoples who are going to be, I think, listened to more by their governments regardless of what happens. There's an awful lot in play here, and it would be unfortunate if we and the U.S. government get so focused on the situation in Libya that we lose sight of all those other issues and don't handle those well either.
Thank you. Yes, Dirk.
Yes, and Steve and I were talking about this before this forum started. In a sense, Libya was the easy case in many ways. You know, what happens when we go down to Bahrain and, you know, possibly Saudi Arabia and so on, where in Libya you could argue we had no national interest. And again, you know, President Obama yesterday in his speech very, very kindly, very carefully avoided the kind of national interest issue. But of course, if we were to go down the road to Bahrain, where we have the Fifth Fleet, to Saudi Arabia and so on, then the issue will really be a lot more difficult. And then some of the issues that Steve mentioned really do come into play.
Quite right, and I think it's important to note that Secretary Gates, in his comments over the weekend with Secretary Clinton, was careful to say he didn't think we had vital interests in Libya. We certainly have vital interests, these are my words, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain. And Secretary Gates said, we reserve the right to act unilaterally to protect American vital interests. This may be the drama ahead of us in the next couple of weeks, a couple of months, if those regimes are truly threatened by their own people or by external forces. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Roger Whalen from Santa Barbara, California. And first I wanted to compliment the panel. It's been a wonderful evening. And particularly the ambassador. Your people should be very proud of having such a candid, sincere man. And we feel happy that you're here. The question to all of you, and maybe primarily to the ambassador, is if the coalition arms the rebels, is the rebel leadership significant enough, seasoned enough to be able to take Gaddafi's troops if armed properly?
Well, if I understand your questions, you know, after the strike start against the Gaddafi forces, we see the change on the ground. Then the opposition, they start to march from east to west steadily. But still, until today, Gaddafi still has a lot of power. He still has tanks, artillery, and he can hit and he can fight back. I think the mission of the coalition is not finished yet. They still have a responsibility to protect the Libyans from Gaddafi's regime. They are not fighting the ordinary people, they are fighting the brigades of Gaddafi's. This march have to be completed to the west. Tripoli is suffering. This is the capital of Libya. It's still under siege. It have to be rescued. Misrata, now it is under shell for the last 5 weeks. It have to be rescued again. Then the mission of the coalition is not completed, because still Gaddafi is a dangerous very dangerous to the Libyan and to the and to the civilian in general. A strike, in my view, they have to be continuing to stop Gaddafi from using power, from using the artillery and tanks against his people. The march to the west to rescue the people who've been under Gaddafi. Then if the resolution of United Nations say to protect the civilians, then the civilian is still under fire of Gaddafi. Then the mission has not completed. The mission have to be there, and they have to strike when it is necessary. And then the Libyan, they will take the Gaddafi out from where he is now.
Thank you very much, sir. Yes, sir.
My name is Kimani. I'm a freshman at the college. And my question is, given whether the intervention has raised the stakes such that Gaddafi feels he must fight to the end, and if this is the case, does the international community have the duty to help the rebel fighters, whether through arming them, training, or perhaps actual physical intervention?
So Steve, maybe you're best placed to, we talked a little bit about this. Will the mission, which is right now quite limited by the UN Security Council resolution, have to be transformed if there's a stalemate?
I think that you would not be able to get the UN Security Council to approve another resolution expanding the mandate. I suspect that there would be enough reservations, possibly even vetoes by Russia or China. So you would not be able to get a formal extension. What you might see happen is the coalitions saying that under the UN doctrine of responsibilities to protect, we feel we have to complete this along the lines that the ambassador just laid out, and that therefore they would essentially take it upon themselves to go beyond what the original UN resolution was, and basically claim that failure to do that would lead to a larger humanitarian crisis down the road. My guess is if we get to that point, it's going to become much more politically controversial. Some of the members of the coalition may step back. Some of those other countries that are not formally part of the coalition that have been more on the fence will become somewhat more vocal. And if the result of this is, as I think I said at the outset, much more large-scale bloodletting, then there will, I think, be much more recriminations both within the coalition and here in the United States as to whether or not it was the right thing to do from the very beginning. I think, again, it is often easier to start these things than it is to finish them, because the opponent has options as well and doesn't always cooperate with what the coalition would like to have happen, namely for him to simply leave.
This is, I think, a very important point to your question, answer to your question. I'm a former ambassador of NATO, very pro-NATO, but the disadvantage of a multilateral alliance of 28 members waging a war is it's a fractious alliance, and it's truly democratic, small d. And I think if we get to the point where Steve is saying we have to make some fundamental decisions to alter the mission, I can see the NATO alliance fracturing over that. And it may be in that case that you have to form a very small coalition of the willing. That's a phrase from the Bush administration, where a couple of countries get together to exert their will because you can't get agreement around a table of 28 countries. This is actually a weakness of using NATO, I think we have to admit that.
And it also, I mean, providing arms to the rebels, I think, would be relatively uncontroversial. But if there's a point at which we've been unable to get this to a final decision, and President Obama is asked, well, you said you weren't going to send ground troops, but are you willing to send a few? Or are willing to send people to train? For all we know, we already have special forces operating there, possibly intelligence assets already in the ground. Are you willing to send more? And we've seen this movie in a number of other contexts where what begins as a relatively small, discrete, intended to be limited operation turns into something much longer. You know, we're all crossing our fingers that that doesn't happen, because that's better for us and also better for the Libyans. But you can't rule that option out.
Thank you very much. A great question. We've got time for 3 more questions. We have 3 more questioners. So we'll have short questions, and we'll try to be very brief here, too. Yes, sir.
السلام عليكم سعادة السفير مرحبا سعادة السفير أساتذة. My question has 2 components. The first one, knowing Gaddafi will not be a man of compromise. If it comes to ground troops, will you think that the provisional government will accept troops, let's say from Qatar, Emirat, Maghreb, or Jordan, under United Nations umbrella with the support of the allies, the United States, France, and the UK? And the second component is, I'm so sad. I'm an Arab American from Morocco originally. I'm so sad to see that l'Union du Maghreb Arabe has completely been obsolete in this. There is totally no support at all, neither from Tunisia nor Egypt. Some very timid support from the King of Morocco, but nonetheless, it's absolutely still nothing. Do you still think that there is a future later for a free United Arab Maghreb to play a role in Libya in the future and really take this alliance forward?
Thank you. Do you want to take the second question, and you'll take the first question?
I'll take the one on the AMU.
Why don't you just begin? Is there a chance, are we going to see unity among the Maghreb countries to support your movement, or not?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, the Maghreb, what they say is born dead, from the beginning, because of the conflict between Algeria and Morocco. If the Maghreb countries, they don't help you, that's fine. But they work against you, this is the problem. Unfortunately, there is one country, which maybe is not good of me to name, they are against the people, against the revolution. And even maybe they're giving shelter to some of the Gaddafi's families. And unfortunately, we've been told that some mercenaries, they came through this country.
You mean Algeria?
Well, I don't say Algeria, but I said one of the Maghreb countries.
He's a very good diplomat.
He's a diplomat. Yeah. Then this is, of course, that's unforgettable action, and at least this is not the time for any country, especially from the Ummah, that act against the Libyan. At least if they stay neutral, we do understand. And we are very lucky that the Libyan people raised after collapse of the regime in Tunisia and in Egypt. Just imagine if this has happened when Zain al-Abidin in the west and Mubarak in the east.
Right.
Now the borders are open, the Tunisians they're helping, the Egyptians they're helping at least the refugees to go safely and for some medical treatment. I think maybe there is a lot of changes coming, not only in Libya. I think we will have a new, it will be a completely changing taking place in not only in Libya and Tunisia. There are the rest of the Maghreb countries. I think some of them, they're having a real problem. Then we hope that one day we'll be able to work something together, But at the present time, I think this will be a great upset, beside the crisis between Morocco and Algeria. Now, I think also the thing is getting worse in the Ummah.
If it comes to ground troop, will you accept troops from, let's say,
Did
Qatar?
you say if it comes to ground troops?
Ground troops, absolutely. Do you think they will accept Arab troops from, let's say, Qatar, Emirat, Urdun?
Well, I think maybe the Arab troops are more acceptable than the foreign troops, if the Libyan, they need them. But I think instead of Arab troops, they come to Libya and there's complication and the relation, and I think if the Libyans just get enough support, we've been training, personnel I think we have. But we need two things, supply of the armament and the continuation of the correlation strike for the Gaddafi forces.
Thank you. Dirk, did you want to say something?
I just wanted to add a word on the AMU, on the Arab Maghreb Union, which, as the ambassador said, in many ways was stillborn. And it remains stillborn in part also because Gaddafi wasn't very interested in it, in part because he couldn't dominate it. But it would seem to me, particularly if Libya reemerges, and here I think that was what the ambassador was hinting at, there's this great opportunity here for Libya no longer to be the kind of spoiler in regional politics that it has been ever since Gaddafi came to power, but really to become a responsible player again within particularly North African politics and beyond. And so I certainly hope that that is going to happen as well.
Thank you. Last two questions. Yes, sir.
I'm Ming. I'm a freshman at Harvard College, and I'm taking one of Professor Walt's class.
Is he a good professor?
Yeah.
That was the right answer.
What did you expect him to say?
That was the right answer.
My question is about what the provisional government is going to do with the followers and loyal, like people who are loyal to Gaddafi, just say after they have won the war. First, let me share with you a story. I come from Vietnam, and the war ended in Vietnam like 30 years ago, and it didn't end really well for both sides, because as the war draw to an end, the people and most of the bureaucrats and army officials of the South Vietnamese government knew that the communists wouldn't be too lenient with them, and the communists made clear that they were not going to be lenient with the South Vietnamese government either. So what happened was that when the communist troops rode towards Saigon, a lot of people from the South Vietnamese government just fled the country, and many died on their way out of the country. Those who chose to stay were actually sent to rectification camps, where many of them died, and many others were executed. Until now, I think there's still a considerable gap between the Vietnamese people who are living in Vietnam and Vietnamese people who are abroad. And my question is that I'm wondering whether this is going to happen in Libya, because what I see is that the people who are loyal to Gaddafi, they don't really have a choice. They knew that the rebels are not going to be lenient with them. They chose to fight until the end. And for the Libyan people, they knew too well that the force under Gaddafi chose to shoot the people, and which led to some sort of situation where the two sides cannot be reconciled. So I'm just wondering, if the provisional government is going to win this conflict, what is going to happen to those who are loyal to Gaddafi, his sons, and even their families as well? So yeah, that is my question.
Thank you for a very important question. Thank you. Professor?
Well, one of the things I have advocated from very, very early on when this conflict started was what I think Libya needs is truly a kind of truth and reconciliation committee, the way that South Africa, for example, had it. Because this is a society that is riven, and that where the divisions between individuals, between groups in society have deliberately been exacerbated by Gaddafi in a very classic divide and rule fashion. And as the ambassador also said, you also have to realize, as you also stressed, that in that kind of society, where you have a dictator in power for 42 years, the majority of people in that society have no choice but to cooperate if you want to have a family, if you want to have a job. And so I see a lot of potential for settling scores once this whole conflict is over. And I hope that the international community is thinking proactively to get somebody in there. I know this has already been discussed at the United Nations, for example. I know that in Washington a couple of people have taken up the idea. The Libyan opposition, one of the Libyan opposition groups in Switzerland has also taken up the idea already. So I hope that will get established in order to prevent what could very well be a lot of bloodletting after all of this is over.
Thank you. You have the last question, and they have the last word.
Thank you. My name is Michael Tai. I'm a PhD student from Cambridge University. President Obama, in his speech yesterday, cited humanitarian grounds for intervention in Libya. He also cited America's special role in defending and challenging democracy around the world and standing beside those who are fighting for their freedom. He went on to very eloquently cite the example of Bosnia. He stated that it took over a year before the Western allies decided to stop the massacre and the killing in Bosnia. And he would not let this happen again in Libya. Now, we all know that one of the main differences between a place like Bosnia or Rwanda and a place like Libya is that there is no oil in those places, and Libya has substantial reserves of oil and gas. My question is, do you think the United States and the Western allies would intervene so swiftly if there was no oil in Libya?
It's a fair question. Professor Walt.
Yeah. I don't think oil had anything to do with it, actually. You'll recall that the United States had economic sanctions on Libya for over a decade. So we weren't buying any Libyan oil. We were discouraging as many people as possible from buying Libyan oil for a long, long time. And people also understood that if we encouraged what is now happening in Libya, that Libyan oil would be off the market for quite some time. So I don't think that that's the motivation here. And I think also you have to recognize the reluctance. The one thing I will credit the Obama administration with on this, although I've had my concerns with how they've handled a lot of it, is they did not leap into this pell-mell. They were somewhat reluctant to go in. It was clear early on as the demonstrations began that they didn't see this as a fight they really wanted to get into. And I think that they waited until there was a lot of pressure from the international community. Certainly, they waited for support from the Arab League as well. So the idea that this is somehow a war for oil, I think, is not right. I would even go further and say, I don't think the United States has been fighting wars for oil with the possible exception of the first Gulf War back in 1990-91. That's a more controversial topic, though, and we'll have to do another forum on that.
Professor.
Nothing particularly to add. I think Steve did a perfectly wonderful job explaining this. The only thing, of course, that what it raises in my mind, your question, is that oil revenues traditionally in societies are very, very divisive. They give actors within societies all kinds of ways to defect rather than cooperate. The fact that we've already seen the question that was raised about the oil shipment to Qatar, and whether or not that's going to be subject to an international commission, something the United Nations has already started to think about also, I think is terribly important, because my hunch is that, again, once all of this is settled, that we'll start to see some fallout in Libya over who is going to be in control of the oil revenues. And as we know, you could perfectly divide the country in a sense and have Cyrenaica go its own way and have Tripolitania be dependent on the elephant field and so on. That's perfectly possible. So I think oil revenues will play a role one way or the other. So that's an indirect answer to your question.
I want to give the ambassador the last word. And thank you for your question. Is there a 30-second intervention that either of you would like to make? Is there something we didn't talk about or a point you wanted to leave us with of how we should understand this conflict?
I would just add one other thing, and I don't want to be overly cynical about this, but I hope that everything the ambassador said about the way the provisional government would proceed when it's in power turns out to be true. But there is a long history that when peoples are seeking foreign assistance, one of the things they do is they tell the foreigners what they want to hear. Right? And it's not surprising, therefore, we're being told that all will be well and democracy will be created there. I think Professor Van der Wel has made it clear that creating democracy is not going to be easy. I think the ambassador understands that as well. I personally also don't think we know very much about the anti-Gaddafi forces. I think it's easy to imagine that they are preferable to Colonel Gaddafi. That's a low bar to clear. I think we have to, I think we have to recognize that this is a society that most of us don't understand particularly well, and getting a desirable outcome is not going to be easy, and it's not going to be quick.
Professor Van der Wel.
Very quickly, I mean, this is a country that, in a sense, has never truly existed as a modern state, with the institutions of a modern state, not even during the monarchy, certainly not during Gaddafi. And so I think that the challenges are reasonably high, and why I'm reasonably optimistic. I'm also quite cautious in light of what I think both oil revenues, the lack of institutions, the lack of national identity, in a sense, in Libya could really bring about. And so I hope it's going to be optimistic, and I hope certainly that the ambassador is right in everything he has said. I'm just holding judgment at this point.
I want to thank Professor Walt, Professor Van der Wel for really great insights, and I want to give the ambassador the last word. Thank you for coming from Washington. Thank you for being with us. Anything you'd like to say in closing?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to the United States. And I just want to make maybe two small comments. First of all, I hope that the action of the United States will not be misinterpreted. We look to the action of the United States to act and to participate in this correlation, that they stand by the American values. And what the United States did now, that will change also the image of the United States in the Arab and Muslim world. This is very important. If you compare between the intervention in Iraq and the intervention in Libya, this is a completely different issue. But the intervention in Libya, that will give the American more respect, more credibility in the Arab and Muslim world. The second thing, that there is no way that the intervention of the United States that because of the economic interest in Libya in the first place. If the Libyans, if they don't sell their oil, then what they're going to do it? They drink it. They have to sell the oil, of course, to the west or to the east, whatsoever. The third thing that the democratic process would not be easy, and I think three of us, and including you, Nick, that it will not be easy. But the main thing that there is determination that we have to go through the process, through the democratic process to establish a new Libya. This intention, it never exists in Libya. We've been ruled by the third international theory, which Gaddafi he put, and that theory, if you go through it, you come out with nothing. You say it is talk about democracy, 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 but there is no democracy in it at all. Like somebody, he's selling vegetables and fruit, and he said he wrote on his shop that he's selling vegetables and carrots and banana and this. And they said, if you just say this shop is selling fruits and vegetables, that's it. Then you see everything about socialism, about equality, about this. But in fact, it's the theory which gives no space at all for the people to act and to exercise their democracy. Believe me, what the United States did is the right thing, that you will see the reaction, but in the same time, you have to see the opposite reaction. Never that the world, they will agree for one action that it is the right action. But what the United States did, I think that will be change a lot the image of the United States, that you stand by the American values, you stand by a desperate Libya people who are fighting for the last 42 years to see the sun. It was never raised in that country for that period. Thank you very much.
Ambassador, may the people of Libya find peace and freedom. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all for being with us. Appreciate it.